Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our final webinar as part of our Topics and Data Sharing webinar series out of the NNLN National Center for Data Services. We are happy to have our speakers today, and today we'll be hearing from the Generalist Repository Ecosystem Initiative, or GREI. And GREI is an NIH program supporting the enhancement of generalist repository functionality to better support NIH data sharing use cases. With this webinar, this topic is about the GREI repository system, supporting data sharing in generalist repositories, and more tips for making good practices in data sharing. We will have an evaluation at the end for our speakers today. We encourage you to wait for that evaluation, especially if you would like MLA continuing education credit, because that code is provided at the end of that evaluation form. Please make sure you are muted, and if you have questions for the speakers, please post them in the Q&A section rather than in the chat. You can have conversations in the chat, ask questions of me, your facilitator, or anything related to Zoom and other webinar-related topics. However, if you have questions for the speaker, again, please post those in Q&A. That way we can make sure we can address your questions at the conclusion of the presentation. We're joined today by representatives from 3 of the 7 repositories participating in GREI: PearlGo, Data Librarian at Northwestern University; Julie Goldman, Research Data Services Librarian at Harvard Library; and Gretchen, let me know how to pronounce your last name. I'm sorry. From the Center for Open Science, I'll let you introduce yourself later when you speak. They'll be sharing more about the generalist repositories and how they fit into the NIH data sharing landscape, detailing the purpose, goals, and outputs of the GREI program, and sharing best practices and examples of data sharing and finding data in generalist repositories. So without further ado, I will go ahead and pass the mic over to the speakers, and I will be available for anything that you need in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Peace, and welcome everyone. We're so glad you're joining us on this Wednesday afternoon. As Peace mentioned, we are your hosts today, Julie, Gretchen, and myself. I'm Pearl. So before we begin, we would like to learn a little bit about you and who's with us today. So if you'd like to please indicate in the chat, tell us a little bit about yourself. Please go ahead. I'll give you a few moments. Thank you. I see responses coming in. Thank you, everyone. Great, let's get started. So Peace already gave us a sense for what we're going to cover today, but here's our agenda really briefly. Okay, let's get started. So here, and again in the chat, if you could tell us how familiar you are with a generalist repository, maybe you've used it before and maybe not, and that's okay. That's what we're here to learn more about today. Thank you. I'll give you a few moments. Right, I see some answers here. So it looks like we have a mix of people who are familiar with GREI and some not. Wonderful, thank you. All right, let's move along here. So the NIH recommends researchers to use domain-specific repositories to share their research data. There are, however, some data sets that may not fit into domain-specific repositories. Generalist repositories ensure that researchers have a place to share and deposit their data. Generalist repositories accept data regardless of data type, data format, content, or disciplinary focus. So you'll see here some samples of the data types that you can share in a generalist repository. So a little bit about GREI. Using the chat, could you please tell us, were you aware of GREI before this webinar? Maybe you've joined some of our other webinars in the past or community calls, or maybe you haven't, and that's okay. I'll give you a moment. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. So GREI is comprised of 7 generalist repositories, and our goals are to make sharing and finding data easier, to support data reuse, to avoid duplication of data across repositories, and lastly, to encourage the sharing and reuse of data. The 7 generalist repositories are Harvard Dataverse, Dryad, BigShare, Mendeley Data, OSF, Vivly, and Zenodo. We are all similar in that we practice fair data sharing, strive to adhere to repository best practices, and use DataCite metadata and persistence identifiers like ROR and ORCID IDs. Our distinct attributes are enumerated in the table on your right. Some of us are built using open source and others using proprietary software. And now we move on to an overview of data sharing and discovery in generalist repositories. We are all familiar with the NIH data sharing policy that went into effect in January of 2023. This requires the submission of data sharing and management plans for all NIH-funded researchers, thus enabling validation of research results, providing accessibility to data sets, and promoting data reuse for future research studies. To support this policy, the NIH and NLM created these resources or websites to help one find the most appropriate repository to use. Here are some samples of these sites. The NLM site on the right provides a little bit more detail, such as subject area, human versus non-human model, type of access. It also notes funding support and links to both access and submission. The NIH does not recommend a specific generalist repository, and these resources can help guide you in choosing one. And here is one more interactive resource created by the NNLM. It's their NNLM Data Repository Finder. Here are some ways that GREI is making data sharing easier. The GREI repositories implement common best practices and standards to enhance data sharing. When researchers cannot locate a repository for the type of data they generate, a generalist repository can be a useful place to share their data. Here is a use case of an NIH-funded researcher looking for a repository to share their data. All GREI repositories share common features and will satisfy requirements such as minting a DOI, collect basic metadata to help discovery and reusability. Each repository also offers unique features. Down here, you'll see some points listed to help you find the best repository to suit your needs. It is also worthwhile to note that data containing sensitive information may not be appropriate to share in all repositories. The resources we shared earlier and some resources we'll talk about later can help you determine which repository is appropriate to use. GREI helps to improve data discoverability in these following ways. The use of DataCite metadata and persistent identifiers improve data discoverability, which leads to greater data reuse. This use case is of an NIH-funded researcher wanting to find data. Here we have a couple of points to keep in mind, which are, does this repository have data I can use? Or does this repository provide information on how I can reuse the data that I find? Next up, my colleague Gretchen will discuss best practices and sharing data and talk about some use cases. Gretchen?
Yes, hi, thank you. Sorry about earlier, I was not set up as a co-host, so I couldn't unmute myself. So my name is Gretchen Gueguen, and I work at the Center for Open Science. So thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about data sharing best practices within GREI repositories, but more in general as well, any repository. But we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that GREI repositories are set up to do well in terms of data sharing. So if you want to go to the next slide. So if you want to share in the chat, what kinds of data or other types of materials have you been involved in sharing, or have you worked with researchers at your institutions to share? Think about all of the different kind of data types and types of materials you may have worked with. If you want to go to the next slide. So you might be thinking of a lot of different things because there are a lot of different ways to characterize data. There's a lot of different things that data can be. So data can have in lots of different formats. It can come in really any format. It could be a text file, like a text or a PDF. It could be numerical, SPSS, STATA, Excel data. It could be multimedia files. It could be groups of images or video. Could be different kinds of models, 3D models, statistical models. It can be any kind of software. Some formats of data are very specific to the particular domains that researchers use them in. So an example is FITS data in astronomy or CIF in chemistry. And sometimes the format of the files that comprise data are very specific to the equipment that creates them. So, some kinds of microscopes or various kinds of lab equipment might put out data in proprietary kind of specialized formats. So that's one way to characterize data. Another way has to do with the content of the data, the type of data. So it could be nominal data, which means that it's categorized, but it's not quantitative. And it doesn't have a natural order. So it could be things like hair color or religion or sexual orientation. Data could be ordinal data, which does have a natural order, but is also not quantitative. So academic grades, A, B, C, D, F. Education degree level, bachelor's, master's, doctoral, a satisfaction rating from dissatisfied to satisfied. Discrete data is quantitative data that can be counted. So the number of students in a classroom, the number of computers in a given space. Whereas continuous data is quantitative, but it's measured. So the temperature in a space, the time taken to complete a task. Data can also be characterized by its origin. Is it the result of an observation, of an experiment? Has it been created through a simulation, or has it been derived or compiled? Ultimately, the data that we're talking about that can be shared as part of a project is any collection of facts or materials from which conclusions are drawn. So data runs the gamut of different types, and those different types can require different considerations when you're sharing them. So if we go to the next slide, once we know what our data is, we can go through steps to share it in a way that is fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So we're going to go through some steps here that are from a guide created by Dryad, one of the GREI repositories. But we're going to talk about it in a more generalized way that could really apply to any repository. So if you want to go to the next slide. So our first step is to gather all of the data that might be needed to reuse the data or replicate this study. So this is really everything. This could include experimental method, raw data, organized data, scripts, visualizations, and statistical output. Often in a project, there are several layers of processing of data, and it's important that you provide enough information to understand how those different layers of processing or levels of processing happen. That doesn't mean, though, that you can't edit out superfluous or ambiguous content that might be confusing. But ultimately, we want to provide both unprocessed and processed data for reanalysis. Including the unprocessed data ensures that no data is lost, and any issues that may have occurred in the processing pipeline can be discovered. It also allows data to be looked at and reused in different contexts outside of the original process that was taken on it. The process data, though, is cleaned and formatted and organized and ready to be reused by others. So when file size and storage size and privacy and restrictions that we'll talk about allow, sharing unprocessed as well as processed data is really a best practice. In addition, we want to include the scripts and the code or the software that has been used to process or analyze the data. So including those things ensures that results are reproducible. So having both the data and the process that you took to go through to create the output allows others to be able to go back and replicate or recreate that study. And commenting throughout that code is also very helpful to understand the logic of it. You may also need to link to data stored in other repositories, code in other software repositories, or in other publications. We'll go to the next step. So after we have gathered everything, next we can verify that we are sharing it properly or that we can share it. So ideally, all data in the study can be shared publicly, and it should all be licensed. It's important during this step to identify materials that need to be restricted. In some repositories, you can store materials and restrict access. In others, you can only share openly licensed materials. Some common types of files you might need to think about whether or not you can share them are content from published articles, grants or patents, and data from third parties that has restricted terms of use. Regardless of whether it's being openly shared or not, all content should be properly licensed so that the user who's going to end up using your data knows what they can do. The creator needs to select a license that's applicable, and they're encouraged to choose the most expansive license possible. Sometimes creators think that not including a license is the most open way to share, but it's actually the opposite. Not including a license means that all of that data is essentially unusable because they haven't given permission to use it. So the least ambiguous thing to do is to always include a license. Some other kind of specific cases are around human subject data that has to be properly anonymized and prepared under applicable legal and ethical guidelines. And if work is done with endangered species, it may be necessary to mask location to prevent further threats to that population. If we go to the next slide, once we've decided if we can share files, the next thing is to make them the most accessible, and that's by choosing open file formats. So this will really maximize accessibility, reusability, and preservability by using non-proprietary open formats. So this is the difference between a text file .txt that can be opened by many types of software, or a .doc Word file that can only be opened by some specific particular types of software. The National Archives, NARA.gov, actually has a really great list of the formats they consider the best for preservation. And that can be a helpful guideline for some common types of materials. You can take a look and see what they recommend, what's open, and you can decide if the files that you have can be converted or migrated into those formats for longer term use. That may not always be the case, though. A lot of research data is created and saved in proprietary formats that are really necessary for the kinds of analysis or use that they're doing. So in those cases, we go back to saving the original raw or unprocessed data alongside the proprietary format, including explicit information about what tools and scripts were used with that particular type of format, or possibly providing an alternate supplementary file in a non-proprietary format, provided that it still adheres to the licensing and privacy standards. So creating a CSV file in addition to the Excel file that has all of the various formulas and specific formatting things. At the very least, you can provide alongside a comma-separated values file that has the data. As you're preparing the files into these open file formats, this is also a great time to review those files for errors. Common things like missing data, misnamed data, mislabeled variables, incorrect file formats, or corrupted files. You can find all of those as you're going through and doing this audit. And you should also try to share the smallest file version possible. But if files are very big, which they very well may be, you can look into using different types of file compression to reduce large file sizes or directories of files. And there are open versions of compressed file archives like zip that you can use as options to reduce that size and make it easier for the end user to be able to download and reuse that data. We'll go to the next one. So once our files are all ready, then we can take a look at how they are organized. So we want to organize our files logically, and we want to name them and organize them in a consistent and descriptive way. So we want to avoid vague and ambiguous file names. So we really recommend picking a couple of rules for naming files and being consistent with those. So keeping in mind that there isn't a general set of rules for file naming that works universally for everyone. What matters more is that you have some rules and that you stay consistent with those rules. And then you document what those are. So you or your researchers will think that you'll remember those decisions, but you may forget down the line. Or you're sharing data, in this case, with the outside world, and the new collaborator or that new user doesn't understand necessarily your thinking. So just documenting in the README file, which we'll talk about next, how that file naming structure works can be really helpful. When naming files and creating that file convention, thinking about ways to make them machine readable is really helpful. So that means naming the files in ways to make them easy to sort or easy to filter. So including date by year, month, day, and all in numerals is one way to make it easy to sort back up and down in a chronological order in a file name. Using a meaningful abbreviation and using them consistently helps you to filter files by that abbreviation based on the who created it or the part of the project that it came from. Another way to create some machine readability in your files is to use version numbers. So instead of just recreating new files, always creating a new version with a version number at the end. Having said that, it's also important to make sure that those file names are still human readable. Self-explanatory names make it much easier to understand later, and you don't have to sacrifice one for the other. Once the files are understandable, you can think about the organization of the entire set. So creating a logical directory of files helps with understanding later on. And creating subdirectories for similar materials and grouping them together makes it easy to understand at a glance what it is you're looking at. So you can see the directories here, and looking at that directory structure tells you at a glance what is involved in this data set. Each of those directories is named logically by thinking about what the content is, why it exists, and how it relates to the other files in the directory. Again, this is another chance to remove unnecessary files as well as we go through this process. If we go to the next slide. Once we have everything organized, we can then create a README file. So a README file captures the context and instructions, to interpret the work. It's just a text document that includes essential information about the files in the directory, the data types, the data formats, the citations, the context of the materials. You write a README file should be written clearly and written for a broad audience. So a clear and comprehensive but concise description of the components in your data set. And that helps others to be able to interpret and reanalyze and understand what they're looking at. You can use accepted vocabularies for your discipline, so you don't have to write it, for just anybody. You can tailor it to those in your discipline, but it should describe what the research is about and how it was created. It may also possibly contain information about who to contact for more information. The README is a place to define variables, define abbreviation, explain missing data codes, and explain which units and allowable values have been used. So this is a place to provide some extra context that may not be usable if someone jumps directly into files that are in your data set. It can also provide the provenance of the dates and locations of the data collection. So it can give people an idea, an understanding of that context that they won't be able to tell just from looking. It can also describe those codes or scripts or softwares that were used to process and analyze the data in the set. So it can walk the person through the process of doing the study and how all of the materials in the data set are used together. So really, it's any kind of details that would influence the reuse or replication of the data. And in the last step on the next slide, we will decide where to share our data. So obviously we're talking about the generalist repositories here. So I'm going to focus on talking about deciding between GREI repositories. But you can remember that these steps and this process can apply to any discipline or institutional repositories, and those may be the best choice. This flowchart is available at the URL here shown. And this is a product the GREI group put together to help decide between various GREI repositories. And in fact, the first two steps, the first two questions, ask if there is a discipline or institutional repository that would be preferred for this content. But assuming that there is not one of those available, the other steps in the process include questions about the need for anonymity for human subject data, the size and storage requirements for the data, the availability of licenses, and the availability of additional specialist services that each of the repositories may have. Ultimately, researchers need to comply with the requirements of their community, their funder, their country, sometimes their publisher, or other stakeholders in the process in order to pick the right repository. And tools like this flowchart can help you make a decision. On the next slide, we actually have another tool that's available to to decide which GREI repository in particular may be the right choice in this comparison chart, which is also available at the link in this slide. And that provides a quick view of features and characteristics of each of the repositories. We, as a GREI group, put together a list of use cases for each of the repositories, which Pearl showed some examples from those earlier. On the next two slides, I will just go over two of the use cases that are available for GREI repositories as regards some functionalities related to data sharing. So in this use case, you can find similar use cases for all of the GREI repositories in the Zenodo community. And it'll be linked again at the end. But in this case, the organization that I work for, Center for Open Science, which has the OSF repository, is writing about using a generalist repository to share data in order to comply with data management and a sharing plan and the conditions of a grant. So in this use case, we highlight the customizability of privacy and licensing in OSF. So paying close attention to those aspects of the data sharing process, being able to make sure that things are available properly and are available in the right context. So we also talk about the ability of creating directory structures through what we call in OSF components. So we've presenting to the user an organized and contextualized group of materials that they know how they are allowed to use and reuse. On the next slide, we have an example of a use case from Zenodo. And in this use case, Zenodo is talking about using the Zenodo Generalist repository as an institutional data repository. So in the case where an institution may not have their own institutional repository. So Zenodo highlights their ability here to meet the NIH's desirable characteristics for data repositories and some easy to use features that enhance fair data sharing, like the use of required metadata and an easy drag and drop file upload interface. So just to wrap up on the next slide, again, these are those 6 steps. In general, we're gathering material, we're preparing it, we're organizing it, we're describing it, and then we're deciding where to upload it. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Julie, who's going to talk about discovery of data in GREI repositories.
Great. Thank you so much, Gretchen. So part of why sharing data is so important is that it does enable other researchers to find and reuse that data, allowing for new discoveries and accelerating research. So there are many ways to find research data. You could search directly in data repositories. You could check out the literature to see what data other researchers are citing. And of course, you can always try a good old Google search. So before I dive into some practices for data discovery, our next kind of question for y'all is, have you used specifically, generalist repositories to find and reuse data or research, either for your own use or for data discovery on the behalf of researchers or others that you are looking for data? So I'll give you everyone a second to think about that. We would love to hear your experience using generalist repositories to find data in the chat. And related to some of the use cases that we are presenting today in this presentation, we always welcome additional use cases that the community has. We will be continuously updating use cases in our community. So hearing how everyone is using these repositories is super helpful. This cackle count, great comment in the chat. Great. Well, everyone can continue to share. I will move on to practices for finding data in generalist repositories. But before diving into your search, you need to take a minute and think about what data you are interested in and where it might be located. So here, this is modified from another NLM class on finding and using health statistics. So these are some basic strategies for finding data anywhere, actually. So first, you want to identify, the type of data you need to answer your research question. This comes back to some of the elements that Gretchen was talking about. Are we looking for a numerical statistic or facts? For example, health indicators. Are we looking for a complete data set for our own independent analysis? Is geographic scope important to us? So where are we looking for, county, state, local data, or national-wide or global health data? Are we looking for individual level data or just aggregate data? Next, you want to think about the organizations or agencies that are likely to collect or share this information. So is it the federal government? Is it a specific health agency or department? Is it an organization, in the private sector? Is it industry or pharma companies? And then lastly, thinking about, are there specific places I can go directly to answer my research needs? So whether that's an agency website, perhaps I want to start with those domain-specific repositories, or I just want to do kind of maybe a first glance at what's out there. A generalist repository can be great for that as well. So next, moving on, I'll talk about some concrete search functionalities of repositories. So once you have that search strategy down, you can leverage search functionalities of repositories. So as Pearl mentioned, the GREI repositories support the DataCite metadata schema, and they have their own unique different search functionalities based on their unique functionality. So some of these will include a variety of keyword, advanced, and faceted searches. So for example, we could be leveraging the metadata structure of the repository. This can really facilitate targeting and narrowing down our search. Next, you may be able to search by funding agency, content type, that geographic location. Perhaps we're looking for data published by a certain journal or an institution. So searching the literature first can actually point to journals that publish studies with linked data. We can use some search functionality for that. Perhaps we're browsing by categories or, featured data sets, collections. For example, we could look for reproducible data sets or replication studies. These would be studies that successfully reproduce results. These are likely to use reproducible data. Also, a lot of our repositories like to feature different communities or groups of data. For example, Harvard Dataverse has a whole COVID-19 data collection that has been highly reused. And then, of course, we can use any number of, sorting, faceting, filtering by year, most relevant subject area or funder to really narrow down exactly what we are looking for in these repositories. So taking all of those kind of strategies and then functionalities of the repositories, I'll highlight 2 use cases as Gretchen did as well. Perhaps you are searching, in this first use case, perhaps you are searching for data on a specific research area or a topic. So in this use case, highlighting the GREI repository Vivly. As a researcher, you are looking for individual participant data on neurodegenerative disorders so that you can validate the findings, reuse data, and build on your own work within the neurogenetics research. So I'm understanding that I want raw data on people who have had, a certain condition or disease, and possibly how they respond to treatment. So I can go to Vivly, since Vivly's unique focus in the GREI ecosystem is on sharing clinical research. So say I conduct a search on Vivly, I can perhaps, start filtering by NIH studies or by industry partners. And this metadata is actually provided by clinicaltrials.gov. So I would select the relevant studies that fit my criteria. And Vivly has this process of, from your search, then submitting a research proposal that would include a statistician to then request access to this data because it is participant level data. So your proposal is then reviewed and the institution must sign a data use agreement to actually get access to this data. And you can access the data on Vivly and actually conduct analysis in this secure research environment right on the Vivly platform, making it very easy to access and work with the data, and then eventually disseminate your own work from reusing the data that was found. So to wrap up this use case, on the next slide, here is just an example of an NIH PI, Michael Ward, who has requested data from Vivli. Specifically, they put in a request for data sponsored by Pfizer and AbbVie. And on the right, we are highlighting 2 publications that were published utilizing this data that was found and reused from the Vivli platform. In the next use case, we would like to highlight, this gets into ways data librarians, like any librarian or administrator, can leverage generalist repositories to track and report on data sharing activities at the organization level. So even if, your university encourages affiliates to use its own, institutional data repository, we should understand that folks may also publish research data elsewhere. So using the Harvard Dataverse as an example here, we can use the repository's advanced search page to find data sets where the data depositor entered the university's name in the data set's author affiliation metadata field. Of course, we want to be sure to account for any spellings or abbreviations of that university's name. So here I'm just highlighting an example of using my own institution. So at Countway Library, we support 3 different schools. So I tend to search for not only Harvard Medical School, but also Harvard School of Dental Medicine, Harvard School of Public Health, and there are lots of acronyms that come with those 3 schools. So additionally, and you can see on the screenshot, those examples of those different search functionalities that I've already mentioned. So utilizing some of that faceting and sorting, I can find exactly the institutions and the research that I'm looking for. And we also want to mention that, searching all of these repositories can be, a huge task. So there is the ability to automate and streamline this discovery, this research data by creating a metadata harvesting protocol that contains the results of your refined search query. So that would just allow us to, allow you to have your university's repository, your institutional repository, and import this metadata on these data sets from the Dataverse into your local instance. This way, you won't need to check your local repository to find data every time. It would be automatically done for you. Kind of going off on some more using Harvard Dataverse as an example, we can also capture metrics on data reuse. So this is an example collection and data set from a researcher at Harvard Medical School. Harvard Dataverse does allow users to restrict files to only allow access to those who agree to certain terms of use. So this Dataverse collection, specifically the Brain Genomics Superstruct project, has these custom dataset terms. So the researchers can track who is requesting access to their work. Additionally, Dataverse installations count file downloads. So these file download counts are aggregated and reported at the dataset level, as well as at the file level. So we can see that here on the example on the slide. We can see, over 15,000 downloads for the project level, and then we can see almost 1,500 and downloads for the README file alone for this dataset collection. I will mention some Dataverse installations also have support for expanded metrics at the dataset level for views, files and downloads and citations using the Make Data Count standards. And Make Data Count is a project to collect and standardize metrics on data use, especially these views, downloads, and citations. And GREI is working very closely with the Make Data Counts standards as well. As a librarian, we can use this for reporting. We can utilize these metrics to support data reuse and also citation reporting. Final two examples when it comes to searching and data discovery. As I mentioned, there are many ways to find research data in appropriate repositories. We're just highlighting here the Google dataset search, which aggregates, normalizes, and reconciles open metadata to allow users to potentially search for data sets across the web. So this is just one example of how, robust metadata can help with data discovery. So just doing a quick keyword search here, we can find that entry to the Brain Genomics Superstruct project on Harvard Dataverse. Of course, like any Google search, we have lots of hits to review for relevance to our query. But it's a great way to just, start off with a search. And then we'll finally highlight another NLM tool. So a new tool that is also trying to aggregate all of these data sources is the new NLM dataset catalog. It's in beta right now, but I think it's a really great tool to use. And again, just here's an example of a keyword search limiting to Harvard Dataverse, where you'll see we are not finding the original data set that I've been highlighting, that Genomics Superstruct project. We actually find a data set that has been derived from it. So another great use case of data reuse. So it's exciting to explore how data sets have been used over time. And just highlighting how this data set was used in a publication, and it points directly to where the original data set lives, also in Dataverse. Currently, this NLM dataset catalog curates data from a few of the GREI repositories with plans to add more in the future. So I will recap here with finding data in Generalist repositories. These Generalist repositories, we want to be leveraging, that standard metadata requirements and structures to facilitate our data discovery and reuse. So using advanced search functionality, searching by some of the key terms identified in your kind of search strategy, whether that's funding agency, content type, institution, geographic location, using featured collections or data sets, and using any kind of sorting or filtering to really narrow in and hone in on the data that you are looking for or helping to facilitate discovery for. Great, so I think that kind of wraps up the content that we had prepared for the webinar. I will just kind of wrap up with ways that you can connect with GREI and interact with all of the wonderful resources that we have. So of course, one goal GREI has is to create sustainable resources that allow researchers to make informed decisions about research practice and dissemination. So you are all encouraged to explore and engage with our resources and training. Congrats, you are attending today's wonderful webinar. We are partnering with NLM On4. So all of our kind of resources are listed here. We have lots of other webinar recordings and slides you can dive into. We have that growing use case catalog, as well as the flow chart and comparison chart that Gretchen highlighted. And of course, we want to be transparent and tell you about some of the forthcoming resources we have. These are all based on community input. So look forward to kind of building off of a lot of the things that Gretchen talked about with a deposit checklist, some additional data management and sharing plan guidance and templates from all of the repositories, as well as looking into steps for data curation in repositories. On the next slide, we just have links, lots of links to all of our support and contact information. And then finally, again, you can connect with GREI whether that's asking questions, providing feedback, just learning about what we're doing and getting updates. We have a GREI forum on Google Groups you can join. We have that GREI Zenodo community. We have a blog where we like to post about all of the resources and trainings that we were doing. And of course, we would love feedback at any point that you have about GREI. So that feedback form is linked for you there as well if you have any feedback for us. And with that, I think I will close, and we look forward to the Q&A for the last couple of minutes here. Thanks for everyone's attention.
All right, looks like we have some questions in the Q&A. So we'll go ahead with the first question, which is, what are the copyright protections for data sets?
I'm not sure who wants to jump in. I'm certainly no expert, but there is a Harvard Dataverse has a page about data sets and copyright, actually, Julie. So I don't know if you're familiar with it, but copyright, you know, if it's technically a collection or technically facts cannot be copyrighted. So it really comes in to play in terms of the part of collecting and creating a collection and creating a kind of interpretation and analysis of it. So I put the page from Harvard Dataverse in the chat there. If the person who asked the question wanted to ask any specific kind of follow-ups, please do.
Yes, absolutely. We'll go ahead to the next question for now. In your experience, do PIs prefer to upload their data sets with corresponding publications? I found it as helpful to have the publications and the data sets together, but some PIs may not do that. Thank you.
Again, I don't want to dominate. My impression would be that it's less about choice than it is about availability. You know, a lot of times the place where the publication is going isn't necessarily equipped to handle the data as well. Some places, some publication outlets do also host data repositories. Some do specify that data go into specific repositories. Data repositories themselves have specific features catered to data sets to make data sets more findable, like Julie was showing. So I don't know if it's as much preference. I mean, it is certainly helpful, however, in a publication to have a citation or a reference to where the data is. I don't know, Pearl or Julie, if you want to add any more to that.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and kind of build off of what Gretchen was saying. You know, when I talk to PIs, I try to, communicate that the publication is not really set up as, a robust place to host that data. So even if we do find, publications that have, supplemental material, a lot of times you find it's just the spreadsheet, just the data itself. There's no good, like, where's the README? Where's the documentation? So even if we just have the data there, we're still missing a lot of pieces on how to interpret and use that data. So that's why we really encourage the use of repositories, which can have all of that packaged together. Another argument, of course, is the discoverability of that data is low. Perhaps it's behind a paywall, right? So there's lots of reasons why we want to move away from having that supplemental materials uploaded with, the publication itself.
Any other comments on that one?
I think I just wanted to add, if it's helpful to know that, Zenodo has this concept of communities. So if you share, let's say, your data set underneath a community, there is a way that you can link it back to like a publication or other supplemental outputs of that research. Thank you.
Thank you, Pearl. Next question is, am I the only one who wonders if the GREI are the only ones likely to be sustained long into the future? So for long-term storage and curation, a safer bet? I'm not sure if that's a question for everyone or a question for our panelists. Maybe you can speak on your long-term outlook.
I'm sure we certainly hope that we will be funded into the long term for our own, job security and the mission of our organizations. Aside from that, I don't know. I do think that I'm not in the position at OSF of, pulling any kind of financial strings or doing any strategy, but we do try to tell our collaborators that we do take sustainability really seriously, and that the support we've received from NIH is a good sign that we're doing the right things. And I think it's the same for the other GREI members as well. There was a question in the chat about our metadata standards, and I just linked to a document that we wrote last year about metadata guidelines. So I'll use the DataCite metadata standard as a standard to adhere to, but we do have some really specific guidelines about how we use it that I linked in the chat there.
All right. Are you hearing of journals or publishers that point authors to one or more specific GRs?
I'm not really seeing specific repositories being pointed to, but I know journals and publishers are definitely at least including them as an option for folks to use. I feel like they kind of leave it open-ended, but that's just what I've seen.
Just in time, we are at the conclusion of our questions. Thank you everyone so much for attending, and thank you to our panelists. This presentation was excellent, and more information will be sent after, again, the slides, so that if you missed the link at the beginning, the evaluation form as well as the recording. Thank you all so much for coming, and have a great rest of your day.